Good evening and welcome to the second Vijay Vyas Memorial Oration. We are very happy to host this oration in its second edition. This originally was supposed to happen sometime in April. We had booked the venue and Professor Anirudh Krishna had also booked his tickets, but unfortunately, because of the pandemic, he was unable to travel. We picked this date. This is a special date because this is the birth anniversary of Professor Vijay Vyas. We are very thankful to Vikram and the family of Professor Vyas for agreeing to be with us on this particular date and also agreeing to share some of their memories of Professor Vyas. The first oration was held last year in Jaipur. Dr. Y.V. Reddy had given a talk on loan waivers. And it was very widely attended by all the people in Jaipur. This time we are doing it online, and I hope it will have a much wider spread and a larger number of people would come in. Professor Vyas was very precious. He was the one who set up the Center for Microfinance in one sense, because when Tata Trust wanted to set it up, they went to him. He wrote the concept paper, and we owe a lot to Professor Vyas, both in terms of conceptualization and for a long time he handheld us as a very important member of the board. In fact, we need to remember all the stalwarts who were there in the CMF board, whether it's Mittalal Mehta ji, Anil Khandelwal ji, or currently Mr. Sisodia, Khanna Saab, Indrajit Khanna Saab, and a whole range of luminaries who have guided us through the process of working in CMF. And CMF has really become fairly large. Today, Professor Anirudh Krishna will give a talk, the second memorial oration. Anirudh Krishna is a professor of public policy at the Duke University, and he is no stranger to Rajasthan. People know him as an IAS officer who belonged to the Rajasthan cadre. His lagav or attachment with Rajasthan goes much beyond just being a ex-civil servant. He also has a small house outside on the outskirts of Udaipur in a village called Shishpi, where he usually all the intellectual output that you see is mostly conceived and written up in Shishpi village, where he spends considerable amount of time whenever he's in India. We are very happy that he has agreed to give this talk. He should have been amongst us, but he's there in Duke with time difference. Thanks a lot, Anirudh, for making adjustments with your time and coming and spending time with us. Thanks a lot, and I'll hand it over to Malika for taking these proceedings forward.
Thank you, sir. Welcome to all the audience. I would now request Professor Vikram Vyas to give us an overview of Professor Vijay Shankar Vyas' life and thoughts, and thereafter we'll share the oration. Thank you.
Sorry. The text. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, is that better? Is that? Yeah, sorry for that. Yeah, I would like to join in with Shriram to welcome you all for the second Professor Vijay Vyas Memorial Lecture. I welcome you on behalf of everyone associated with the Ajit Foundation. And I would like to thank especially the Center for Microfinance, who really have been responsible for setting it up, and to Professor Anirudh Krishna for agreeing and to make it all happen in rather challenging times. So what I thought I'll do is give you a very brief idea of what Ajit Foundation is, with which I am associated, and some glimpse of what Professor Vyas meant to Ajit Foundation and to many of us. So Ajit Foundation is a volunteer organization which is working in Bikaner since 1994. And its aim was to create a spaces which would nurture creativity among young people and a sense of responsibility. It was started by my parents, and the initial impetus was the death of my younger brother. And I took a break from academics and joined the foundation in '94. Its three activities are, we are focusing on community libraries, science center, and what is perhaps most relevant today is the dialogue series. As you can imagine, because of the COVID, the first two of these activities we had to stop, but we are trying to revive them in some form. I wanted to share with you all an email which I got a few months back from one of the young people who used to attend the Ajit Foundation's dialogue series. And since the fonts are small, I'll read it. I removed his name because I didn't get time to take his permission to whether I could quote him or not. So it says, "Dear Dr. Vyas, I hope you're doing well. I'm writing to you to get in touch regarding Ajit Foundation Bikaner. I'm born and brought up in Bikaner. In fact, minutes from the Ajit Foundation. As a young person, I got great support and some intellectual exposure to the library there and the lectures organized by the foundation, especially two by." And then he mentions two lectures which had a great impact on him. And then he goes to GNU to study. And currently he says that I'm pursuing a PhD in ethnomusicology at University of California, Los Angeles. I'm writing to share that in near future, if there's anything I could do to be part of, to sustain this kind of endeavor in Bikaner, I would like to be part of it. And so you can see the dialogue series and the kind of dialogue series that we are having can have a great impact. And that's why my father was very keen when we started Ajit Foundation to include the dialogue series. We are very fortunate that when I was thinking about this event, and I was wondering what is the value of naming a dialogue series after this person. And it occurred to me that the key thing is it establishes a kind of trust in the mind of a prospective listener. So we are very fortunate that we had Dr. Reddy for the first Professor Vijay Shankar Memorial Lecture, and today Professor Anirudh Krishna as the second speaker, in establishing that trust. And what I mean by trust is that this gives us a kind of freedom that in future, say a few decades perhaps, whenever we would have a luxury of inviting a person who's not as well known as Professor Reddy and Professor Anirudh Krishna is, but who has thought creatively. And still, there will be people who would come because they have a trust established through the lectures that Professor Krishna will give and Professor Dr. Reddy gave and Professor Krishna will give. So I think to me, I think that was the value of naming something after a person and a dialogue series. I'll go very briefly through what many of you knew him well, but there are many I'm sure who don't know him. But there's one way of sort of telling who he was like what he did when he was born. As he said, he was born on 21st August 1931. He did his PhD in University of Bombay, then taught at Bombay University, then he went to Sanapatal University, Vidyanagar, then to IIM Ahmedabad. He also served as and those are things, many of the things he did. But I think what perhaps is more pertinent is what were his central concerns. I think, as far as I could glean as a son and often later on working with him in Ajit Foundation, that he was an agriculture economist, but whose central concern was small farmers in India and rural poverty. He was also, especially in the later days, a public intellectual who firmly believed in secular democratic India. And the range of his intervention in public sphere were quite varied, ranging from being a member of Prime Minister's Scientific Advisory Committee. Of course, he was a member of Economic Advisory, but he was also a member of Scientific Advisory Committee, to his last committee work, which I believe was on Gaushala in Rajasthan. And I think he took all of those assignments with equal seriousness. And I think that was one of the things which is quite something which shows both emulating. There are a few other things which many of you who knew him would probably agree with me, that he had a great sense of listening. He had developed an art of listening, I think, and that I thought it would be nice to remind ourselves of that, especially on this occasion. I believe the reason he was a very good listener was because he had a humility, not modesty. He was not falsely modest, but he had a humility to acknowledge that a speaker has to say something which he has not thought of. And he had a humility to acknowledge that what he holds dear can be challenged and should be challenged. Another thing which was equally amazing to me was his intellectual curiosity. In fact, I recall just before he passed away, he had refused to go to, he had cancer, he didn't want to have any interventions. But we had taken him to a homeopathic doctor and he asked her that how this homeopathy works. And she's told her for 5 minutes. And he listened with such intensity and the curiosity which was really quite remarkable. He was also a serious scholar who was not easily disturbed from his work. And finally, he had finished his memoirs before his death, and he had finished his memoir just before his death, which has been now published. Okay, and now I'm just going to end my sort of introduction, and I'm going to ask Malika to show a video. This video is a home recording on the occasion of his 85th birthday, and in which he kind of remembers his time as an undergraduate in Bombay University. And the background to it is that when he went to Bombay University, his key passions were Hindi literature and student politics. And economics took a distinct third place in those years. It was only because of his close friend Ratan Bhatia, whom I'm hoping is present here. I mean, I requested him to attend this talk. And it was Ratan who convinced him that he should move to economics. So I think I'll let the video start. Thank you, Malik.
Election, I won, he won.
Oh,
So he won as a chairman, I won as a secretary. And so we had started in a different camps. But then when we started talking, and so then we became then good friends. And finally, we became very close. And I was in the student movement. I was this National Union of Students at the time, socialist. So I was Bombay secretary of Bombay Union. And then we had a conference in Belarus, where I was proposed to be the General Secretary of
All India.
All India General Secretary at Belarus Conference. So I was preparing, so we used to have tea together. We went to this restaurant called Chetana, very close to Bombay University, the clock tower. And he gave me a lecture. And usually I do not listen to these lectures, but somehow I listened to it. He says, you do your MA first, and then you go to your student movement or whatever you do. Having coming so far, why do you want to leave? Somehow in Kalbadevi, and there was this C-Ward student union. So I was the secretary of the student union. We wrote manifesto for our union. So I was searching for some platform. So we went to C-Ward union, and then I was made secretary vacancy. And from there, the mainstream student movement, National Union of Students. So there were two camps at that time. One was socialist, another were communist. Communists were also very powerful at that time, Student Federation. And Raj Kapoor and all those people used to come from the Federation. And we had followers of JP, Jayaprakash Narayan and others. Lohiya. From the ground floor, take a left, go to his third floor. Nobody, except him, Brahmanan was there sometimes. So I stayed as Asmukh Bhatt in his room, and we stayed, and then I shaved off my hair. Because I said, otherwise I will go out, again meet people, so on, so shaved off. And then I got there. I got a good second class. I said,
oh, good.
so it changed in that way. That was
But you know, I mean, I never was in the student movement. I didn't want human to be. One day, you know, a Vakil calls me to his office. He says, I want you to stand for the presidency of chairmanship of the student union. I said, I've never been interested in why do I want to stand? No, we have these radicals who are standing and make a mess. So you are a simple person, you will do it.
followers of JP, Jayaprakash Narayan and others.
लोहिया
लोहिया से फिर तो मेरा बहुत घनिष्ठ हो गया सब। वेरी क्लोज टू लोहिया। जयप्रकाश से भी बहुत अच्छा रहा। जयप्रकाश sent me to US already.
Thank you, Professor Vikram Vyas. As Sir shared, we were very privileged to have Dr. Y.V. Reddy with us deliver the first Professor V.S. Vyas Memorial Oration. He spoke on the theme of loan waivers, bleeding hearts and thinking minds, and through his oration, he brought to light the visionary recommendations of the expert committee on rural credit of the RBI, which was headed by Professor V.S. Vyas in 2004. As we are now having to do this second oration through a webinar, we will play a short clip to release the monograph of the first lecture. Thank you. Thank you. Soft copy of the monograph will be available on the CMF website, and we would shortly be also publishing it. Those interested can contact us for the hard copies as well. We are equally privileged to have Dr. Y.V. Reddy join us today also. I would request Dr. Reddy to say a few words. Thank you.
Okay, is that okay? Is it okay now? Family members of Professor Vyas, distinguished speaker, Professor Anirudh Krishna, Professor Sriram, Professor Malika Srivastava, and friends. I am grateful to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this event. It gives me an opportunity to recall my close professional and personal association with Professor Vyas lasting several decades. The subject of today's memorial oration, Poverty After the Pandemic, Building Back Better, is most appropriate, particularly because it relates to an area very dear to Professor Vyas's head and his heart. It is also of great current relevance. We are fortunate to have a distinguished speaker in Professor Anirudh Krishna. He combines global credentials as a scholar and as a person with practical experience in policy formulation and execution in India. The subject is of great contemporary interest since policymakers are facing humongous problems in macroeconomic management in India. First, monetary policy is not an ideal instrument for targeted impact. In any case, the monetary policy instruments in terms of liquidity and interest rates have already been liberally used. Perhaps we in India are at a point when more of the current policy initiatives on monetary policy may be counterproductive by igniting speculation and inequalities. Second, as regards financial sector, the effectiveness of regulation depends on the state of financial intermediaries. In the current context, the financial intermediaries themselves, especially banks, are vulnerable and in any case, understandably risk averse. The credit channel, therefore, becomes very weak. The poor, by definition, are also risk averse and rightly so. Third, trade policies like monetary and regulatory policies may serve the poor indirectly, but impacts on poor are not very predictable. Finally, fiscal policy, therefore, remains the most significant instrument for serving the poor. The problem confronting the policymakers and administration is to design policies and deliver mechanisms that are able to give urgent sustenance, immediate relief, and above all, dovetail all this with the medium term objective of poverty alleviation. It is in this context that today's lecture by Professor Anirudh Krishna gains special significance. I join my friends in looking forward to the memorial oration.
Thank you, Dr. Reddy. Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Now I would request Professor Anirudh Krishna, who's Edgar T. Thompson Professor of Public Policy and Political Sciences, Duke University, USA, to address to deliver the second Professor V.S. Vyas Memorial Oration. We are equally grateful to him for sparing us time for us early in the morning because of the time zone difference. Professor Anirudh Krishna has been civil services bureaucrat from the Rajasthan cadre, and therefore it makes it all the more special for us to have him deliver the second oration. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Anirudh Krishna from the Center for Microfinance and Ajit Foundation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Malika. Professor Sriram, Professor Vyas, and family members of Professor V.S. Vyas, Dr. Reddy, Mr. Sisodia, and Mr. Khanna, if you are there, sirs. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the difficult task today of following in the footsteps of Dr. Reddy and speaking in honor of another stalwart whose actions I admire greatly. I have not so far had the good fortune of meeting one-on-one with Dr. Reddy, a lapse I hope to make up and rectify soon. But I did have the opportunity to meet a few times with Dr. V.S. Vyas. He had just taken over as the director of IDS Jaipur when I was taking a leave of absence from my government position in Jaipur and going to Cornell. But he followed me to Cornell. As soon as I reached there, my professors asked me, "Oh, you've come from Jaipur? You must know Vijay." That was Professor Vyas. A few weeks later, I went to the World Bank and the same story. Do you know Vijay? So Professor Vyas was greatly loved, greatly admired. We traveled in similar worlds. He dealt with small people, small farmers, questions of poverty, and I do the same thing. It is in the spirit of honoring his years of dedication to the cause of social and economic justice that I offer the following remarks with humility. I'm now going to turn the PowerPoint on. You will see me in a corner. And if I am not doing this right, since I have not yet become an expert at this, someone will please have to tell me where I am screwing up. That is exactly what I'm trying to do. Here we go. Okay. All right. Good. And I'm standing in the right place and everything else is go, right? Okay, great. Thank you very much. Go ahead. You were saying something? Very good. So the architecture of my discussion today is in the first part, in about 10 minutes, I will set the context. What did the situation in respect of poverty look like at the eve of the pandemic? In the second part, which is shorter, I'll speak specifically of poverty and discuss how poverty comes into being and how it is reduced in practice. In the third part, I'll speak to how the pandemic comes in as a new factor here and upsets the traditional relationships and heightens the impetus to create poverty. And in the last part, I will come back to being my policymaker self, and I will look to see what these results point to by way of both short-term, but especially longer-term policies. So let's start with the context. In the past 2 decades, India, or past 4 decades really, India has achieved enormous progress. If you were to take somebody out of India in 1980, they never see India again until today. And 40 years later, you bring them back, they will not recognize the place. The airports, oh my God, the airports, state of the art. We have dollar billionaires. We have Indian multinationals. We have continuous macroeconomic stability year after year. And internationally too, India is no longer seen as only a poor country. But that's the good part of the story. At the other end, if we just step out of our homes, our offices in India, walk a few hundred yards, we see the same old situations of poor people, disadvantaged people, people using age-old technologies, people living on the margins of existence. There are 2 parallel tracks in India. One of the early indications of these parallel tracks is given by the share of households who own what are usually regarded as middle-class assets. This is what the international middle class usually has: a computer at home, credit cards, a car, financial assets, travel abroad. The percentage of households in India who are able to do any of these things or possess any of these assets is still very small. In urban areas, slightly more, but in rural areas, much less, 1 to 2%. In urban areas, 4, 5, 6, 10% at most. This distinction between the Indians who have and the Indians who don't have comes out as clearly if you look at monthly per capita incomes. These are figures for 2012. You'll have to apply an inflation factor, but the basic structure does not change. 44% of rural households lived on below 1,000 rupees per person per month. 1,000 rupees per person per month, which equates almost exactly to less than $1 a day. But if you look at the number of people who live at, I'm doing something wrong in the calculation. I'll do it again in my head as I'm talking. If you look at the number of people who live below 2,000 rupees a month, that is almost exactly $1 a day. That's 74% still in rural areas and almost 50% in urban areas. The share who's making more than 10,000 rupees a month per person, which is what you and I would probably regard as the basic minimum for a decent existence, is still about 2% in rural areas, maybe 3% now, and 6% in urban areas. This comes through even more clearly when we look at the following graph. This is a little complicated, but let me just explain it. Give me a minute. The x-axis, the horizontal axis, represents successive 10% segments of the world's wealth distribution, the world's. The poorest people in the world are on the left side of the chart. The wealthiest people in the world are on the right side of the chart. Each country is represented by a stream graph. Let's look at Australia right on top. You see that Australia's stream graph is fat at the right side and almost non-existent on the left side. This demonstrates that a very large percentage of Australia's population is in the top 20% of the world's wealth distribution. 75% are in the top 10% of the world's wealth distribution. Same story with Japan, almost similar story with Switzerland. Now go right to the bottom of this graph and look at Malawi. Almost the entire population of Malawi is contained within the poorest 30%. There are no people on the right side. Similar story with Guinea-Bissau, similar story with Ethiopia. These are poor countries with poor people. Now look at India in the middle. There are people in the poorest 10%, the next poorest 10%, the next poorest 10%, all the way up to the richest 10%. 2 to 5% of people in India share the lifestyles that are lived by 75% of people in Australia, but 30 to 40% in India share the lifestyles that are lived by the poorest people in Malawi. That makes for a very difficult policy-making situation because a country must at the same time appeal to the needs of the poorest in the world and the richest in the world. Few other countries have this kind of situation. The task of policy, as I see it, should be to take people from the left side of this curve and move them to the right side of the curve, from the poorest to the richest. You should see many individuals moving up from poorer positions to richer positions, particularly intergenerationally. But the pace of intergenerational improvement in India is not very high. In fact, according to Pranab Bardhan, professor of economics, India has one of the lowest social mobility rates in the world. The child of a poorer parent ends up being poor. The child of a richer parent ends up being rich. These results which you're seeing in front of you are the answers to the questions that my research team and I asked in 71 villages of Andhra, Gujarat, and Rajasthan. The question was simple. What was the highest position in any walk of life that anyone from your village achieved over the past 10 years? We asked this question in 2011 or 12, so it was 10 years before that. In many villages, people looked at us like we were stupid. What do you mean highest position? Everybody becomes a farmer and farms half the area that your father used to farm. But in some villages, people had become something that other people recognized as higher positions. But in the majority of cases, these were village school teachers. These were Jawans in the Indian Army. There were some police constables. There were very few people whom we would recognize as higher paid people like doctors or engineers. We repeated the same exercise in the slums of Bengaluru, in the slums of Jaipur and Patna, and found very similar answers. Very, very few people, hardly any, are moving up, the children of small farmers or the children of slum dwellers, and becoming something big. At the same time, the aspirations many of these people hold in the same 71 villages, we asked kids who were still in school, girls and boys, 14 to 22 years old in school and college, what do you want to be when you grow up? Simple survey question. The majority of them mentioned the same low-paid positions that they had seen in the past. They have seen people as school teachers. That's the pinnacle of achievement. That's what they see. That's what they know. They can't even conceive of other careers. And even if they can conceive of other careers, they have no way of knowing how to get from where they are to where you need to be in order to become an airline pilot or a business executive or a college professor or an engineer or something like that. The same story comes through if you look at it from the other end. So in a different research project, my colleagues and I went to a bunch of desirable destinations in India. Where do young, ambitious people in India want to go? Well, we looked at engineering colleges, we looked at business schools, and we looked at the higher civil services. Who gets in, who does not get in? In engineering colleges of different quality tiers, ranging from the IITs to fourth tier engineering colleges, we found that the percentage of rural students was 2 to 9%. 9% if you take the weakest definition of rural as someone who went to a rural school for even 1 year. But if you take a more strict definition of rural as someone who spent all 12 school years in a rural school, that percentage goes down to 2%. Still, more than 60% of India is rural, but the share of rural students in engineering colleges is 2 to 9%. Huge imbalance. Similarly, business schools, different quality tiers, students with less educated parents, fathers with less than college, mothers with less than high school, tiny percentages. But if you take the same criteria and map it onto the population of India, you find that kids of this age group, whose fathers have less than college, mothers have less than high school, are more than 60% of that age group. Against that, tiny percentage get into business schools. Who are these kids? Well, these are kids who grow up in towns more than villages, whose parents are both highly educated, whose at least one parent has a professional job or individual business. Similarly, the last one, higher civil servants. These are two batches of the IAS and allied services whom I was lucky enough to interview at the Mussoorie Academy, who grew up without a motor vehicle, a scooter or a car, tiny percentage. It's the more privileged who are getting through to each of these desirable destinations. If an individual is multiply disadvantaged, a woman and rural and less educated and SC/ST, there's absolutely no one with all of those qualifications in any of these desirable destinations. We have a problem. The flip side of this problem is seen when you look at our collective results. This first chart shows the number of patent applications. So it's in the field of science and technology. Number of patent applications per million people. Japan 2000, Korea 339, Malaysia 38, India is with Rwanda in this comparison. But that's science and technology. Let's look at new businesses registered per million people again. India is with Haiti and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Take a third area closer to my walk of life, number of research publications per million people. India ranks with Swaziland, below Argentina and South Africa, just above Malawi. Or take a fourth area of competitive achievement, number of Olympic medals won per million people. It's a logarithmic scale. India is far below the next lowest country in the world. Countries above it are not necessarily rich countries, but there's something missing. And my hypothesis here is that just because a large share of the population in India is unable to compete, is unable to think beyond school teacher, is unable to get access to labs or business incubators or sports facilities or any of these things, that it's only a tiny part of our population, the 2 to 5%, the dollar economy people and the hangers-on who have access to these venues, in order to give greater opportunities for individuals to develop, and therefore for the collection of individuals, the country to develop faster, something needs to be done. What needs to be done? Well, here's the problem. To investigate this problem, I've spent years and years. This is the longest I've been away from India at a stretch. I was last in India in January. I should have been there again in March and again in June for research, but anyway, that's another story. What is happening and why is it happening? Why do we have this cleavage between the dollar economy and the rupee economy? Why do we have continuing low achievements at the bottom? And how is the pandemic likely to affect this situation? That's what I'm going to talk about next. I don't have time to cover all of this. I'll just give a little plug for my book, The Broken Ladder, which came out a couple of years ago, from which I am giving this part of the presentation. The book looks at, and the research I'm about to report looks at grassroots, primary grassroots research that I did and my colleagues did in 5 Indian states and 3 state capital cities. Sriram already told you about my spending a few months every year in my village home. I do the analysis of national data. Dr. Reddy mentioned my government experience, and I met widely with people in different walks of life who are knowledgeable about these things. My explanation of why we are where we are has to do with a number of factors, including 4 principal ones. I think there's a huge rural-urban gap here. In particular, as you go more than 5 kilometers away from the nearest town, you start arriving in parts of India where much of the technology is still 15th century, where you have the poorest roads, the worst schools, the worst clinics, and then you turn around and call those people backward. Second, I think the second factor is the false god of urbanization. It was widely believed by planners in India that urbanization would do to India what urbanization had done to poverty and demographic transformation in the West a few centuries or a few decades earlier. That hasn't happened. Urbanization has led to a very different kind of situation in India, one that is in no way unequivocally a situation of progress. Third, ordinary people in India continue to live in a highly vulnerable situation. There are a large number of people who are living on the verge of poverty, vulnerable to falling in at any point. These are the people who are going to be hardest hit by the pandemic. And finally, I think that even as we as a country have invested hugely in physical infrastructure, we have underinvested in human beings. We have underinvested in human talent. Let me explain what I mean by each of these points. Here's a graph. I'm sorry for those of you who don't like graphs. I don't see how I can combine Zoom with explaining all these things, so bear with me. I'll just look at the first of these bar charts. The first of these bar charts, which says TV, color or black and white, you see 6 vertical pillars above it. The darkest pillar on the left corresponds to the biggest cities, Mumbai, Bengaluru, Kolkata. That's the percentage of households in Mumbai, Bengaluru, Kolkata who own TVs, black and white or color, nearly 100%. The second pillar is for the medium-sized towns, the Jaipurs, the Patnas, almost 90% more. The third pillar is for small towns, the Churus, the Sanganers. Again, 90%. TV is a very ordinary thing now. But now you go to the fourth pillar, and that's when you're going from cities to rural areas, and that number falls. It plummets to 40%. That's in the inner belt of villages within 5 kilometers of towns. If you go further to the second last pillar, that's villages 5 to 10 kilometers from town, the number falls further. Same story for any other asset you look at, electric fan, refrigerators, motorcycles. The largest percentage is in the biggest towns. The smallest share is in the beyond 5 kilometer villages. That's assets. Now, if I were to draw a similar graph for school quality, for school test results, for availability of medical facilities, for quality of roads, for quality of internet connection, for all of those graphs would unfortunately look exactly the same, which means if you take two equally smart, two equally hardworking kids, one growing up in a city, one growing up in a beyond 5 kilometer village, the kid growing up in the beyond 5 kilometer village is constantly and consistently at a cumulative disadvantage. Beyond 5 kilometer villages are roughly 50% of India. I mean, we think we, because we speak of it, are India, but they are India. They're having a continuous and a deepening crisis. The per household land ownership, per agricultural household land ownership was almost 3 hectares in 1950 at the time of independence. It's less than 1 hectare now. Productivity has gone up a little bit, but nowhere near 3 times. As a result, the average farmer makes much less today compared to what her grandfather used to make. And I say her advisedly, because a large number of farmers on their fields today are women. Where are the men? Well, someone has to go to the city to earn an extra income, because what you make from the farm today provides only 1/3 of the average farm family's needs. You have to earn a supplementary income. There's very few ways of earning a supplementary income in a village. You have to go to the nearest town. But because you have been educated in a low quality school and have typically had to leave school to make an earning by the time you are 14 or 15, the kind of job you get in the city is that of a mazdoor. And so we have anywhere between 100 and 175 million people who make the trek every year from villages to cities, some to a nearby city in a daily up-down way, as they say in Rajasthan, but some who go further afield for weeks or months at a time. We all know these people. We've just seen them on television. 69% are still in rural India. Rural India is not going to fade away. If you look at the census, every 10 years, the share of people in rural India falls by 2%, 3%, not more than that. It will take a couple of 100 years before rural in India is reduced to the size of rural in Europe. And still, there is very little thought to how rural India can become the focus of a new strategy for India. It's always thought to be something that holds India back. The trouble is that these people who've consistently had preparation side weaknesses are now running into significant supply side weaknesses. Uh, the urbanization that we are experiencing is a Dickensian urbanization. We are not seeing people coming off farms and being absorbed immediately into unionized jobs on assembly line manufacturing. That's what happened in a stylized way in Europe and North America. But that's not happening in India, partly because the people who are coming off farms don't have the kind of high school credentials that the Europeans and Americans had, and partly because there are no assembly line jobs. The technologies of production today require many, many fewer human beings than are available. So a particular demographic moment is meeting with a particular technological moment in such a way that urbanization is leading to a huge growth of informal employment and a huge growth of slums in India. There are slums and slums and slums and slums. More than half the population of Mumbai lives in a slum of different kinds, and Dharavi is a nicer slum. These are slums in Bengaluru, all four of them. They are slums. The slums at the extreme right bottom, which is covered in blue tarpaulins, is the shabbiest kind of slum. That's where you meet with many people who are first generation migrants from their villages. But the slums, the rest of the slums, particularly the posh looking slum on the upper left, yes, that's a slum, have been around for decades. And people who live here are third generation, fourth generation residents of the city. They are not recent migrants. They have no connection with the village, but still, the vast majority of them are in informal sector jobs. There's no security, there's no contract, there are no benefits. Hardly anybody in even the poshest slum is studying to be a doctor or an engineer or a lawyer or some such thing. There's a whole variety of slums that my research associates and I have plotted in 3 cities. Just a cute graph. I thought I'd share it with you. The third factor, I'm going a little quickly now. I'm aware that I'm running out of time. The third factor is a very high rate of vulnerability. Lots and lots of people in India are falling into poverty all the time. Let me give you the story of one man who lives in this same village where I spend time every year. I'm going to call him Chunilal. So Chunilal was not rich, but not poor either. He had a plot of land. This was 10 years ago. He had a plot of land. He had a few cows, some buffaloes, a camel, a few sheep, a few goats. And he was saving up money to dig a second well on the other side of his land so he could then have assured water during the off-season, grow a second crop. But that was not to be. I mean, his dad fell seriously unwell, and the local cures did nothing to fix his problem. So when the dad was very seriously ill, they rented a jeep and took him to the district hospital, which is about 30 kilometers away. They spent a lot of money on the jeep. They spent a lot of money on the treatment, but the old man died. And then they spent a lot of money on his funeral feast. So all that savings went away, and they had to take some debts. But Chunilal said, it's okay, we'll manage, a few good years and we'll be back to where we were. But misfortune followed misfortune. Chunilal's wife fell seriously unwell after a failed delivery, and the story repeats itself. There's more money spent on medical treatment. There's more debt. The herd of animals gets sold one by one. The jewelry gets sold. And then finally, when they are so poor, Chunilal says, I have to earn an extra income. So he goes to a nearby mining site and hires himself out as a day laborer. But one day, a big rock falls, crushing his knee. There's no medical aid on site. He waits for a couple of hours in agony before the money is arranged, a jeep is arranged, the district hospital. Same story. One after the other, three misfortunes. Today he is among the poorest people in my village. This is not an isolated story. This happens all the time. Economists have calculated that between 3 and 5% of people in all of India fall into poverty every year on account of catastrophic health expenditures alone. Poverty is essentially dynamic. There are people moving in, there are people moving out all the time. These are studies I did in 6 different countries. I've highlighted the results for Rajasthan, Gujarat, and Andhra. What I'm trying to show here is that over a period of 25 years, ending in 2005, when these studies ended, 1980 to 2005, 11% of all households in 35 villages of Rajasthan moved up and out of poverty. Simultaneously, 8% fell in. In every village, there was some moving up, some moving down, all the time. No matter where we went. In Gujarat, same story, every village. Andhra, same story. Bangalore, same story, every slum. Some percentage moving up, others just across the street falling down and becoming poor at the same time. Overall, we calculated that 1/3 of all poor people were not born poor, but have become poor within their lifetimes. It's not just some fringe groups that are falling into poverty. Even average middle class people have become desperately poor, like that Chunilal guy. Once you become poor, it's not easy to come out of it. There are tens of millions of people hovering around the poverty line who are the near poor people who are waiting for one calamity, one illness to drive them into poverty. And thus, you need not one poverty policy, you need one policy to take people out of poverty, but you need another policy to prevent people from falling into poverty. Bad health and high healthcare expenses are the single largest factor that leads people into poverty. 88% of households who fell in poverty in Gujarat had at least one health episode. The problem is when you have both a large infection rate, when you have lots of illnesses or lots of road accidents and injuries, and then you have very high out-of-pocket payments, OOP, very high out-of-pocket payments. Just as they ruined Chunilal, they are ruining financially, bankrupting lots of households. There are other reasons too which lead people into poverty: high interest debts, job losses, crop failures, akal, high funeral costs, dowries, expensive weddings. But the single largest factor is bad health and high healthcare expenses. The reasons for escaping poverty: the majority of rural households who escaped poverty did so not through the route of agriculture. Only about 25% who escaped poverty did so with the help of agriculture. They planted a new cash crop. They newly benefited from irrigation. They were able to establish a better market connection. But 75% of the people who moved out of poverty did so by going out of their village and getting a job in the urban informal sector as a chowkidar, security guard, a maid, a lorry loader, a pizza delivery boy, parking lot attendant, construction worker, street side vendor. You know the kinds of people I'm talking about. You meet them all the time, less so now that they have run away to their village. Much less frequently regular, stable, formal sector jobs. Okay, why Is this the story of escape? Why don't we have a better story of escape? Well, that's because of the fourth and last factor that I will talk about, of the underinvestment in individuals. This is the picture of the school in my village. Historically, there has been hardly any education in rural areas. The parents, especially the grandparents of today's young villagers, are mostly illiterate, not because they didn't want to go to school, but because there were no schools in villages more than 30 or 40 years ago. Even today, as the ASR reports show, there is consistently poor quality. This is not rocket science. It's a problem that many other countries have fixed, but we're not fixing it. But it's not just a problem of education. It's also a problem of shortages of role models, shortages of support services, shortages of career guidance, shortages of career information. Let me tell you one more story. And if I'm running out of time, Sriram, please let me know. Otherwise, this story, a couple more things, and I'm done. And this story is that of a young girl called Leela. I call her Leela. Her actual name is something else. Who I met in a slum in Bangalore. Brilliant girl, brought up by a single mother. Father died when the girl was very young. Mother and daughter decided that the daughter is going to grow up to be a doctor, because if there was a doctor in the family, we would have saved daddy. So girl does very well in school, but after finishing school, she has to sit the medical college entrance examination. And for that, you need to go through very expensive preparation classes. She didn't want to ask her mother for more money, so she said, I'll study on my own. No one told her that there were NGOs in the area who were running free classes for kids just like her. There was no information. There was no place to get the information. She wrote the exam. She didn't get a good enough result to get into a government medical college, but she was offered a place in a small, new, for-profit private medical college. Again, she thought she didn't have the money, so she didn't accept the opportunity. No one told her that bank loans could be taken for the purpose, because no one around her had ever done anything like this. No one told her that, medicine's not the only thing. You could become a dentist. You could become a occupational therapist. You could join the new thriving field of biotechnology. Kids growing up in our kinds of households imbibe all this information just from the atmosphere in which they grow up. But kids who are ambitious and want to go beyond their status in situations such as the one you see in the picture in front of you don't have any of this available to them. They have no idea, even if they want to become an airline pilot, how one does any of these things. What are the pathways? Where do you want to go? As a result of which, even though many people have escaped poverty, they are almost all in the twilight zone. They're all hovering in a zone of near poverty. The 25% who escaped from poverty on account of agriculture, the average land they hold per family is less than 1 acre. What can you do with that? The ones who escaped by virtue of moving to the city encountered this Dickensian urbanization. All of this is the background against which we can now anticipate what's going to happen as a result of COVID-19 and as a result of the economic dislocations that were caused by the response to COVID-19. I would say there are two main routes that will lead people, millions of people, into poverty on account of COVID-19. The first is the health shock itself, right? That's the most abundant reason for people falling into poverty, is the health shock. in states, in parts of India where the infection rate is high and the out-of-pocket payment is high, many, many families will become poor on this account. Similarly, where the mortality rate is high and there are huge funeral expenses or the principal income earner of a family dies, that's a huge health shock. But I think in this particular case, the numbers affected will be even larger on account of the livelihood shock. What the livelihood shock has done is it has taken away the main conduit whereby families from rural areas could get the extra money they needed to go above the poverty line. That money, that source of income has just been taken away and is only gradually and patchily being restored slowly in small fractions. There is evidence that my colleagues and I are currently running phone surveys. I don't have a lot of faith in phone surveys, but there's a lot of precautions. We're running phone surveys in Bangalore and Patna, and we're finding evidence of between 40 and 70% of families either cutting back on essentials or liquidating assets. Now, as you can imagine, once you start liquidating assets, you're on the slippery slope to persistent poverty. And I think that will lead to a large number of families getting poor in the long run unless effective measures are taken. So potentially huge increase in short-term poverty. From what I could ascertain, there is a commendable government response together with large amounts of private philanthropy, which is going in with this emergency relief, food rations, dry rations, cooked food, gas cylinders, in some places cash assistance, which are preventing mass starvation, which are holding the fort at this critical time. That's good for a short term, for an immediate response. But longer term, if you are to equip the population to be more resilient to shocks and pandemics, and believe me, this is the first pandemic in our memory. It's not going to be the last pandemic. Climate change is waiting in the wings. There are other calamities that can happen. If we are to make the population resilient to shocks, I believe we need to invest in at least 4 different policies, and how we manage in these 4 areas will influence how well we do by our people. The first one is public health care. We just talked about how that's the principal driver of people into poverty. You stop it right there, the production of poverty is choked off. The second place, I think, where we need some intervention is by way of more effective social assistance. And I guess we're all aware that more than 80%, 90% of all new jobs in India are created in the informal sector. A person can work in the informal sector her whole life, and at the end of her life, there's no pension, there's no healthcare, there's nothing. You are chewed up and spitted out. And in order to prevent people from being vulnerable to these kinds of situations, the conditions of informality need to be formalized gradually. Sickness benefits, pension benefits. I'm not saying make every job a permanent job at the get-go, but yes, some protections, some benefits. Third, educational quality improvements. Why is it that kids who go to school for 7 years still spell and add like 3-year-olds? That's fixable. It's not rocket science. And people are working on it, and people are working on the other 2 endeavors too, and I wish them all the best. My own personal favorite at this time, which I want to invest a lot in, is the 4th kind of policy, the social mobility supports, so that there are fewer Leelas in future, so that talent, wherever it is able to connect with opportunity. What's missing? Why are these kids not able to climb as high as their individual capacities allow? Well, first, they lack role models who show them what's possible. They lack motivation and guidance. You can do it. So what if you're a illiterate farmer's daughter? You're smart. You can do it. They need career information. Here are the different things you can be if you want to be. Here's how you get to each of them. This is the risk factor. These are the rewards. This is the pass percentage. Kind of information our kids get. Why can't that be made more broadly available? And finally, only supplementary education and financial assistance. Financial assistance matters, but it's not the most important missing input, much as, sometimes we think otherwise. Luckily for us, this is not tabula rasa. For more than 10 years now, a bunch of organizations in India, whom I call collectively as social mobility promoting organizations, have been pioneering different models of action on a small scale. Some are working with role model development. Some are working with motivation and guidance. Some are working with supplementary education and career information. Some are doing all of these things. They have a track record. We know how it can be done, but it's being done on a very small scale now. It needs to be widened. It needs to become a social movement. Why do I think social mobility is so important? I think it's important because if one child in a neighborhood, if one child in a village becomes something worthy, becomes a engineer or becomes a IAS officer or whatever, I'm just using these two examples, other kids will be inspired. If he can do it, if she can do it, my child can do it too. That's when they'll start putting pressure on school teachers. Hey, why aren't you teaching my kids well? You're paid a fat salary. What's your problem? Can we sit down and resolve your problems together? It catalyzes citizenship. There are tested methods. We can't have a situation in which we continue to have hundreds of thousands of talented kids ending up becoming mazdoors year after year. This needs to be scaled out. It needs more visibility, more support, your support. That's where I'll end. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for the very thought-provoking memorial oration. The pandemic has definitely provided us an opportunity to critically reflect on how to build in long-term resilience and the case for social mobility support to live up to the values of equality, equity, a lot of which has also been discussed in your book, The Broken Ladder. And we feel that majority of the participants who are today attending from the development sector, from the members from the government, as also from the academic institutions, it is for us also to reflect on how we are joining hands with the government, how we are coming together to take this issue of social mobility forward. I now hand it over to Professor Sriram for the question and answer session. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Malika. Anirudh, I have a series of questions. So the way we are managing it is people are sending in questions to an administrator and it's coming onto my mobile phone. So I'll try and read out the questions as much as possible. We'll try and take as many questions as possible within the time limit. The first question that we have received is from Priyanka Khanna. It says, how long would it take before a country gets back to track economically as was prior to the outbreak ante? This is it's a sort of a predictive question. Would you like to take it, or should I sort of give you a few more, and would you like to take all those together, or shall we go question by question?
I think if Dr. Reddy is still here, he should answer this first question. He's the man with the bird's eye view of the whole economy. I'm the guy with the worm's eye view. I look at things from the point of view of an ordinary villager. So, Priyanka, it's a great question, but I don't have the expertise to answer it. So I must duck it.
Okay. In fact, I should tell you, Dr. Reddy has famously said that in general, across the world, the future is uncertain. In India, even the past is uncertain because you keep getting revised data all the time. So anyway, that's on a lighter note. There's one more. What mechanism at community, state, and market level do we need to adopt to dealing with the uncertainty?
Sriram, your voice was breaking up. Could you please repeat the question?
Yeah. What mechanisms at the community, state, and market do we need to adopt for dealing with the uncertainties?
Okay, so that's another great question. And I'm glad you mentioned community in addition to state and country. So let's talk a little bit about community. One of the things that I think is the requirement of a good society is democracy at your doorstep. If your school teacher isn't showing up, you should be able to fix that without having to take many days off work, and being frustrated and taking favors from folks. If your electricity is not arriving in your house, you should be able to get that fixed, whether you're in a city or whether you're in a village. So community mechanisms of community governance in addition to village panchayats are required. Similarly, in the city, there's very little citizen access to everyday governance. And I think those are things that we ought to be constructing at the community level, which can take care of essential governance tasks, make things more predictable and less uncertain. State and country level, I'd rather not go there. I'm the grassroots guy.
A question that is there from Dr. Umakant Vyas. Do you think joint families help to deal with this pandemic?
That's a wonderful question,
particularly
Mr.
in surviving this.
Yeah. This is another wonderful question, Mr. Vyas. I think the simplest answer is if you were to think of a human being as both a mouth and a pair of hands. So what joint families do is they increase the number of mouths and they increase the number of hands. And it all depends on the dynamic within the joint family. If the hands prevail over the mouths and stomachs, then the family is fine. It's doing really well. More people are earning. But if it becomes a question of these are so many more mouths to feed and only one or two people are earning, then the joint family becomes a liability more than an asset. So the answer is, as always, it depends.
Here is a question from your friend Rajiv Sahai. He says skill mapping is a tricky issue. Should there be a centralized agency to do it? Can our local bodies like PRIs and ULBs do it? This is about skill mapping.
Hi, Rajiv. How are you? Skill mapping, I don't know what you're talking about. Skill mapping, if you're talking about taking an individual and subjecting her to some tests and then figuring out what she should be going into, kind of a career guidance test. I don't know if there are good ones around. I am in touch with a couple of NGOs who are pioneering or trying out some of these things. If you meant something else, Rajiv, I'm sorry I didn't understand your question, but I'll be coming to Jaipur shortly and we can talk again.
We really hope that you'll be coming to Jaipur, and we really hope it will be shortly, Anirudh, because then we'll organize one more in-person lecture along with us. So there's one from Ramesh Kumar. throw some light on state government's consistent failure in creating avenues for employment, always, though they always intervene to try and create employment?
Ramesh, I would not be too harsh on state governments for this reason. I mean, employment creation is not directly in the hands of governments unless they employ lots of unproductive civil servants. It's mostly now a situation in which employment is being created largely by private employers. Because of the technological advances that we discussed a few minutes ago, the number of new good jobs is going to be nowhere near the number of people looking for new good jobs. And so we will always have an employment problem if we think of employment as the only way out of poverty, because traditionally that's what people have done. They've gone out, got a job. But I think we are now in an era where it's not going to be jobs, it's going to be small businesses or big businesses, it's going to be entrepreneurship that is going to be the way out for many more people than jobs are. And we're already seeing evidence of this. The informal sector has lots and lots of informal entrepreneurs. Why don't we just recognize the reality for what it is and make the entrepreneurial experience more beneficial for those who will go into that area?
Anirudh, this is a question right up your alley. I mean, this is because it's sort of a methodological question. It says that most of the time when we go to the field and we try to understand the need of the person, we don't get what he needs, what he or she needs, and how do you extract that information as to what is the best solution for an NGO to intervene? I mean, how do you understand this?
That's a fabulous question.
This is from Savant Ram, just in case.
I've spent now more than 15 years. I spend at least a month every year in this small village of less than 100 households. 15 years, I still don't know what their real needs are. So, if you figure out an answer to that question, please let me know. I don't know if I even know my own innermost needs. So, if you get into this, into these levels and into these further removes, it's very hard. But it's not irrelevant, because if you ask somebody what's your need, I'll tell you what my immediate need is. My immediate need right now is to go get some breakfast. It's very early in the morning here. So as soon as we are done here, that's my immediate need. But that's not what you're asking. You're asking me what's my biggest development need. I think it's a matter of structuring the conversation. I think it's the matter of having an ongoing conversation. An NGO who wants to ask that question once and then go away and never have the conversation again, well, there are NGOs of that kind.
So one of the ways we addressed that issue in our research, Anirudh, was to try and see, instead of asking leading questions about the future, was to try and see what was their exhibited behavior in the last 8 or 10 years. I mean, and therefore simulate that and say that if there was this sort of an incident and this is how they behaved, can we simulate it in a much better way? The intervention could be in a much better
way. Sriram, we also did that. I mean, in those poverty studies I was mentioning, in those 100 villages, what we would do is we would do this analysis of poverty, interview hundreds of households, find out what factors led them into poverty and what factors brought them out, and then do an immediate analysis while we were still in the village. We'd spend 3 to 4 days in every village. And at the end, we'd have a discussion with them. Here are the major factors that have been bringing you people into poverty or preventing you from rising out of poverty. Your main need, therefore, according to this analysis, is a health clinic. And that's not what you're stating is your need. But when you
Right.
confront them with the analysis, when you confront them with the experience, they say, "Ha, theek keh rahe hain. Health is the main thing." And it's not just because aap keh rahe hain, it's because they've realized it. So it goes back to this whole thing is what kind of a conversation are you having, I don't think that that's very different from whether you're talking to a policymaker, whether you're talking to an ordinary villager. Both will ask you for evidence.
Okay, this is from your colleague, former boss, I suppose, Sisodia Saab. Given the state capacity, should NGOs be consciously encouraged by the government to play a more vigorous role to achieve some of these tasks?
Good evening, sir. How are you? Great question. I think NGOs have done a fabulous job, particularly in Rajasthan, where we've had some of the pioneering NGOs, both in a previous generation of NGOs and in a current generation of NGOs. And living in Udaipur, I've come in contact with both generations of NGOs and figured out the work they're doing. In my way of thinking, the NGOs can do the best by demonstrating the worth of new ways of action, new programs, new ways of action. NGOs can never replicate the scale of government. I mean, we are not Bangladesh where Grameen Bank and BRAC are countrywide. We don't have countrywide NGOs, and I don't think we ever will or should have countrywide NGOs because, then what the government going to do? But if I were to do this allocation of roles, what can NGOs do much better than government is to nimbly pioneer new things, new programs, new ways of action. All of these social mobility pioneering activities that I was talking about has been done by this group of 50 or 60 NGOs with whom I'm in touch in different parts in India. But once something is known, once something has been tested at a smaller scale and its bugs have been removed, that's when the scaling up part, there has to be this dialogue, this conversation, this intermeshing between governments and NGOs.
Okay, there are two related questions. Both are pertaining to agriculture, Anirudh. One from Vishwas Garg, which says, are there any examples of success in agriculture which has helped people move out of poverty? The second is, your talk gave an impression, unintended perhaps, that there's not much hope in agriculture, particularly as far as upward mobility is concerned. So both are related to agriculture and mobility.
Hi, Vishwas. If you're the same guy I know, then you're asking characteristically hard questions. So,
The second question was by
yes.
Navneet, by the way.
Okay, and hi, Navneet. No, let me correct myself. I love my dal roti, right? So agriculture is the dal roti. But if you take away agriculture, those people's dal roti will go away, and mine too. But agriculture, it's not the fault of agriculture. It's the kind of asset distribution that we have. There's tiny pocket-sized farms. That's a huge source of stability. It's a huge source of self-esteem in rural situations. But 1 acre is not something on which you can become rich unless you are growing flowers for the Amsterdam market under hothouse conditions. So my point isn't that there's no scope in agriculture. My point is that given the asset base of an average farmer, to expect that she would be able to rise out of poverty on the basis of that agriculture alone is a false hope. There needs to be something else. That something else can, of course, be a brand new innovation in agriculture, which triples or quadruples the productivity of the same amount of land. I have seen a few instances of enhanced productivity and agriculture becoming the route out of poverty, 25%, as I mentioned. But on the whole, on a large scale, I'm not seeing the kinds of productivity innovations that will enable a wholesale transformation. I would be very happy to be proven wrong.
Anirudh, there are three more questions, or I've just got the fourth one. I'll stop here. I will not take any further questions beyond this four. I'd let you go have your breakfast, and I'd also like to go back, and most of us would like to have a dinner as well. So one is Googly from Avanti Singh. She says, as a public policy scholar, which of the initiatives taken by the government of India, which of the public policy measures taken by the government of India during COVID-19 have been the most effective?
I thought you said 4 questions.
Yeah, I mean, this is the first of the 4. So I can go through all 4 questions.
Yes, please.
Yeah. What should be the role of corporates? Particularly, are there good models of PPP in dealing with such situation? Then information, as you have pointed out, makes a difference in supporting decision making. Do you see digital opportunities changing this in any way, both an aspiration and opportunities? That's Vartika. And Rajesh Shingi, who's used to be on our board and is a member of the society and runs Iptida, has one question saying that every year the government of India says that poverty is reducing. So what are they saying? Given that your data seems to indicate something else.
Okay. Let me take those questions in the reverse order. So, Rajesh, if we take the narrow measure of poverty that the government of India focuses on, which is the national poverty line, or even if we take the World Bank's lower poverty line of $1.90 per day, then poverty in India has diminished. It's that poverty below the $1.90 is less than 20% today. It used to be 50-60% when I was growing up. Terrific. But just consider one other benchmark. The second poverty line that the World Bank looks at is between $1.90 and $3.10, the lower and the higher poverty line. More than 40% of people in India are in this twilight zone. They have just come up just above the lower poverty line, and they are waiting for one calamity, one illness to be plunged back below this line. This is the number of the precarious, the vulnerable, the near poor, call it what you may. And that total number, A plus B, has stuck close to 60-65% for a long time. It's when people start moving above this line, the second line, and are no longer near poor or vulnerable, that I will feel more optimistic about the whole thing. I am not denying that there's been a huge achievement in reducing the lower number. Of course, that's the poorest of the poor. But I want to set a slightly higher standard for when we should be optimistic in this regard. The question about digital information, oh yeah, there's a huge scope for digital. School quality improvements, social mobility messages, telemedicine. You know, the story we're always told is villages are scattered so far apart that we can't provide the kinds of specialized concentrated services in villages that we can provide in a megalopolis, in a big city, because the population is very concentrated. Digital is the way out of that conundrum. I'm very upbeat about those possibilities, though like anything else, it's not a panacea. It'll have to be part of a package. It'll have to be part of a package with a fair amount of human input. You can't just throw a kid into a room with a video and expect the kid to learn how to repair a car. Corporates, what's the role of corporates? Plenty. I mean, quite apart from the 1%, 2% forced charitable giving that the tax authority requires of them. I think corporates, many of them have, through their hiring practices, through their partnerships with local authorities, shown many stellar examples of what they can do. I think corporates can do a lot more by way of stepping up the social mobility prospects of people. Where are the initiatives that are looking for brilliant artists among kids in India? Where are the initiatives that are looking for brilliant musicians all over India, particularly in poorer parts? Here's where, corporates can come in and claim some area and say, we're going to take responsibility for producing India's next Grammy winners 10 years from now, something like that. And there are examples of corporates who have done some things like, not exactly like this, but of this kind. I have the example of Cafe Coffee Day in the book. Maybe that example is outdated, but it's just by way of showing that corporates can do a great deal and should do a great deal and are doing a great deal. What's the best thing the government of India did? Well, the worst thing the government of India did was to keep me from coming to India. But that was probably also the best thing. I think India's was one of the first government responses that took the whole thing very seriously and announced a lockdown of the kind that should have been announced by every country very early on. Did it have the whole strategy mapped out? Of course not. Did it screw up? Of course it did. Everybody did. I mean, as individuals, we did, because no one's seen anything like this before. No one could predict how long it was going to last. We still can't predict how long it's going to last. So I think this question should be put into an envelope and saved for now. And when the whole crisis is over, then we can come back, revisit the question, and see what the answers are.
So, Anirudh, two bonus questions for us. I'm sorry, we are postponing your breakfast a little bit. One is by Rajiv Vyas, his Professor Vyas's son. So we should take it today, given that it's the birth anniversary of Professor Vyas. And his question is: will direct access to market help farmers increase their income and break the middleman nexus in controlling the income of the farmers? And I don't want to let go of the privilege of asking you a question myself. So, because every time I see you, I get more and more doubts. And you are my professor who will clarify that. So when we go back and look at the policy responses, as a result of the pandemic, all these policy responses were embedded in rural schemes, MGNREGA, direct benefit transfer to your Jandan account, which was all this thing. And it was the urban migrant population who were trying to sort of, try and find some stability between the lockdown and their respective homes, but at least the first generation, second generation migrants. So have we sort of failed in looking at urban poverty? Has it just fallen by the cracks in the government policy making? And does it need to have a new vision?
Sriram, as usual, your question is not a question, but an introduction to a book. So I'll try and deal with it as efficaciously as I can, but let me deal with Rajiv's question first. So Rajiv, as far as I can tell, most farmers are not net sellers of agriculture produce. They are net buyers of agriculture produce. The share of agriculture in a farmer's income has fallen rapidly, and most farmers are subsistence farmers who don't make enough for their own subsistence. So the question you're asking is still relevant, but it's relevant to a subsection of farmers, and these are the farmers who are selling surplus produce in large amounts. I would venture that these are mostly farmers in the green revolution areas. Uh, Definitely, what you say about direct access to farmers, about farmers' ability to acquire market power in competition with those who buy from them. That was, I understand, the whole logic of the FCI and public procurement, but public procurement doesn't happen for all commodities. So we need to have ways of enhancing the market power of farmers in other commodities. I don't know exactly what the best way would be, but I would defer to those like yourself who have dealt with this for a long time. Sriram's question about urban poverty and rural poverty, uh, this is not peculiarly an India question. Worldwide, much less is known in developing country contexts about urban poverty, and the study is relatively new. And the concepts and the policies are being ported from rural to urban areas. Uh, though sometimes they are like square pegs in round holes. Uh, Much more needs to be done to study urban poverty and to not think of it simply as an outgrowth of rural poverty, because as we were just discussing, the majority of people in slums in India are not first generation migrants. Many, the majority, have been in city for 4, 5 generations. It's a different demographic from the one that goes back and forth from villages. The 100 to 150 million nowhere people are in addition to the slums. And as of now, we know relatively little about slums. Of course, Sriram and I have both been doing work, some of it together, in slums. So perhaps the question was supposed to be a means by which I could give a plug to our work. Right, Sriram?
No, no, not at all, not at all. Anyway, thanks a lot. I mean, the plug was a bonus. Uh, I'll hand it over to Malika to do the rest of to carry us through the rest of the evening.
Thank you, sir. Uh, Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Anirudh Krishna for making this second Professor V.S. Vyas Memorial Oration a truly memorable one with a very thought-provoking discussion. We are very fortunate we could hold it on Professor Vyas' 89th birth anniversary. I would like to thank Mrs. Lakshmi Vyas, Professor Vyas' wife, Mrs. and Mr. Vikram Vyas, Mrs. and Mr. Rajiv Vyas, the eminent board of CMF led by Professor M.S. Sriram and the board members Mr. N.S. Sisodia, Mr. Indrajit Khanna, Ms. Girja Srinivasan, Ms. Aparna Sahai, and Mr. Ajay Singh Mehta, who have all joined us, along with the earlier founding members, Mr. Rajesh Singhi, Mr. Devilal Vyas, and from Aravali, members from Aravali, as also one of our founding members, Ms. Vartika Jaini. So we've been very privileged to have all our founding members also join us. Last but not the least, I'm very grateful that we had around 246 audience who have joined us for this memorial oration, and a lot of appreciation has come in for this great opportunity to hear you, and something for which we'll have to work on as active citizens, as also development and academia, as also from the government side. I'm very grateful to Professor Anirudh Krishna, Dr. Y.V. Reddy, and the Vyas family, as also my colleagues from CMF, Kumar, Vijay, Palak, who've supported in organizing this, as also the agency Dreamcast, Gautam and Rajat from Dreamcast, who made this event a glitch-free one. Thank you so much for this, and have a very great evening. Thank you.
Thank you.